Every family has a word. Not a name, not a nickname. A word that gets attached to one specific person early enough in their life that by the time they are old enough to question it, the word has already done its work. Maybe the word is sensitive. Maybe it's dramatic. Maybe it's the one in your family. Imogen Hale's word. The word that had been attached to her since she was 11 years old, and that followed her for the next 30 years through every holiday dinner, and every group text, and every carefully worded comment delivered with a sympathetic head tilt by relatives who believed they were simply describing a fact about her rather than enforcing a function within the family system. The word was difficult. Imogen Hale was the difficult one. This was understood by everyone in the Hale family the way certain facts are understood without ever being formally established. Nobody could point to the exact moment the label was applied, and yet everyone, including Imogen herself for a significant portion of her adult life, simply accepted it as an accurate description of who she was, rather than what it actually was, which was a tool. A very old, very effective tool, first deployed when she was 11 years old at a company picnic, for the specific purpose of making sure that something true would never have to be discussed by the people who most needed it to stay buried. Welcome to Venom Thread. This is the story of the family reunion where, after 30 years, every single lie the word difficult had been protecting finally collapsed at once, in front of everyone, with nowhere left to hide. The Hale family, from the outside, presented as the kind of family that other people described as close. Holidays were elaborate and well-attended. Group photographs from family events showed everyone smiling in ways that did not look performed. Imogen's parents, Walter and Diane Hale, had been married for 41 years and were regarded within their extended social circle as a model of long-term commitment. Imogen's older brother Desmond had grown into the specific kind of adult son that parents describe with visible pride at every opportunity. Successful in his career, married to a woman named Priya, who everyone agreed was lovely, father to 2 children who performed exactly the kind of charming precocity that made grandparents glow. And Imogen, the middle child, occupied a different position entirely. Not estranged, she attended the holidays, she was included in the group chat, she was invited to everything. But she occupied her position at every family gathering the way a smoke detector occupies a room. Present, necessary in some abstract sense nobody wanted to examine too closely, and universally regarded as something whose primary function was to go off at the worst possible moments. The incident that established the label happened at a company picnic when Imogen was 11, hosted by her father's employer at a public park 40 minutes from their house. She remembers the day with a clarity that she has spent considerable time, across multiple years of therapy, trying to understand. Not because the memory itself is unclear, but because the way her family subsequently treated the memory was so thoroughly at odds with what she knew she had seen that the disconnect itself became a kind of permanent disorientation she carried for decades. She had wandered away from the main picnic area to use a restroom near the parking lot, and on her way back, she saw her father standing close to a woman Imogen did not recognize, near a row of parked cars, in a posture and proximity that even an 11-year-old understood was not the posture of casual work colleagues. She saw them kiss. Not briefly. Long enough that an 11-year-old standing 40 feet away had time to fully register what she was seeing before either adult noticed her. She ran back to the picnic blanket where her mother was sitting and told her, immediately, breathlessly, exactly what she had seen. What happened in the following 60 seconds reshaped the next 30 years of Imogen's life. Though she did not understand this at the time, because she was 11 and she believed, with the complete and uncomplicated trust that children extend to their mothers, that telling her mother the truth would result in her mother doing something about it. Diane Hale's face, Imogen remembers, did something specific and fast. A flicker of something that looked, for less than a second, like recognition rather than surprise, as if some part of her had already known or suspected this exact thing and had been waiting, with a kind of held breath, for the moment it would finally surface. And then the flicker disappeared, replaced by an expression of concerned confusion, and Diane said, in a voice loud enough for the 2 other mothers sitting nearby to hear, that Imogen must have misunderstood what she saw, that she had an overactive imagination, that she was always seeing things that weren't quite there and turning small moments into big stories. Imogen, 11 years old and absolutely certain of what she had seen, insisted. She insisted in the specific escalating way that children insist when the adults around them are not believing something they know to be true, and that insistence, that refusal to simply accept the correction and move on, became, in the family's subsequent retelling over the following months and years, the actual incident. Not the affair. The insistence. Imogen had made a scene at the company picnic. Imogen had said something upsetting and then refused to let it go even after being told she was wrong. That was the story. That became the story, repeated at family gatherings for years afterward in the specific tone families use for affectionate, but slightly exasperated anecdotes about a relative's quirks. Remember when Imogen swore up and down she saw something at the company picnic and just would not drop it, even after we explained she'd gotten confused. What Imogen did not know, could not have known, at 11, and would not fully understand the scope of for another 29 years, was that her father's affair had not been a single isolated incident contained to one company picnic. It had been ongoing, on and off, for the better part of 3 years before that picnic and would continue, in various forms and with at least one different partner, for most of the following decade. Diane had, in fact, already known by the time of the picnic, not with certainty, but with the specific, dread-soaked suspicion of a wife who has noticed enough small things to construct an unwelcome theory she has not yet had the courage to confirm. Her 11-year-old daughter's breathless, certain report had landed not as new information, but as the confirmation Diane had been actively avoiding, delivered at the worst possible moment, in a public setting, by the one person Diane could not simply ignore or dismiss without doing something. So she did something. She did not confront her husband. She confronted the messenger. She recast the truth as a fabrication and she recast her daughter. In that single 60-second decision made under the social pressure of 2 other mothers sitting within earshot, as a child who said dramatic things that weren't true. It was, Imogen would understand decades later, the single most consequential choice her mother ever made. And her mother had made it not out of cruelty, but out of the much more mundane and much more devastating instinct towards self-preservation that operates inside people who are not prepared to face what they already, on some level, know. The label, once established, did not require active maintenance to persist. This is the part of family scapegoating that Imogen found hardest to explain to people outside her family, including, for many years, herself. Nobody needed to actively lie about her on a regular basis. The label simply became the lens through which everything she subsequently said or did was filtered. When she pointed out, as a teenager, that her father was frequently and unexplainably absent on weekends, this was read as Imogen looking for problems again. When she expressed, in her 20s, concern about a pattern she observed in her brother Desmond's early relationship with Priya, a controlling quality to how he managed Priya's friendships and finances that Imogen found genuinely alarming. This was read as Imogen being unable to be happy for her brother's success, jealous of the attention he received, unable to simply let people live their lives without inserting her opinions. Every single instance, across 3 decades, in which Imogen identified something true and uncomfortable that the family preferred not to examine, was absorbed by the label and converted into further evidence supporting the label, in a closed loop that made the label essentially unfalsifiable. She could not disprove that she was difficult by being right, because being right, within this system, was simply additional proof of difficulty. Imogen left for college and built a life at a deliberate distance, not estranged, never formally cutting contact, but constructing a career and a circle of friends, and eventually a marriage in a city 3 hours from her parents that allowed her to engage with her family at a frequency and intensity she could control. She attended Christmas. She attended the occasional birthday. She did not attend everything, and the things she did not attend were noted, gently but unmistakably, as further evidence of difficulty. She's pulling away again. She's always had trouble staying close to people. She built, over 15 years, a version of peace with this arrangement that she has since described as functional, but not honest. A peace that depended on her not raising things, not pushing, not insisting, the exact behavioral pattern the label had been designed to produce. And this functional peace held for 15 years, until a phone call from her brother's wife, Priya, on an ordinary Tuesday evening, cracked it open in a way that Imogen had not seen coming, and that set in motion everything that followed. Priya called Imogen directly, something she had never done before in the 11 years since she and Desmond had married, and asked, with visible difficulty, whether she could talk to Imogen about something private. What followed was a conversation that lasted nearly 2 hours, in which Priya described, with the specific, careful precision of someone who has rehearsed how to say something many times in her head before finally saying it out loud, a pattern of financial control and isolation within her marriage to Desmond that had escalated significantly over the previous several years. Priya described not having independent access to the couple's joint accounts despite contributing her own income to them for over a decade. She described Desmond's habit of characterizing her concerns, whenever she raised them, as her being too sensitive, too suspicious, unable to trust him the way a wife should. She described feeling, increasingly, that she was losing the ability to trust her own perception of her own marriage. And then she said something that made Imogen go completely still on the other end of the phone. She said, "I think I'm becoming you. The way they all talk about you. I've started noticing that whenever I bring something up, Desmond, and even your parents find a way to make it about something wrong with me instead of something wrong with what I'm describing. I didn't understand it until recently. I think I finally understand what's been happening to you this whole time, because it's starting to happen to me." This was the first twist, and it landed with a specific and devastating force because it confirmed something Imogen had suspected but never had external corroboration for. The label was not a unique judgment about her individual character. It was a mechanism, a reusable tool the family deployed against anyone who threatened to disrupt the comfortable surface of how things were supposed to look, and it could clearly be redeployed against a new target whenever the situation called for it. Priya was not difficult. Priya had spent a decade being a model daughter-in-law, warm and accommodating and beloved by everyone in the family precisely because she had never, until recently, said anything the family did not want to hear. The moment she raised a real and legitimate concern about her own marriage, the same machinery that had been running on Imogen for 30 years had begun, almost immediately, to identify her as a new and necessary site for the same corrective treatment. Imogen asked Priya, carefully, whether she had told Desmond's parents anything about the financial situation. Priya said she had mentioned it to Diane once, hoping for support. Diane's response, Priya said, had been to suggest gently that marriage required patience and that perhaps Priya was putting too much pressure on Desmond during a stressful period at his work. The same sentence structure, the same redirection, 3 decades apart, deployed against 2 completely different women, with a precision that suggested either remarkable coincidence or a family system so practiced at this particular maneuver that it had become entirely automatic. Imogen began, for the first time in 15 years, actively investigating rather than simply absorbing. She was not looking for revenge. She has been clear about this distinction every time she has told this story, because she understands how easily it could be read as a campaign rather than what it actually was, an attempt to finally understand, with full information, what had actually been happening in her family for 30 years, after spending 3 decades being told her own perceptions could not be trusted. She started by going through old photographs and documents in storage at her parents' house during a visit, with her mother's permission, ostensibly to help organize decades of accumulated family material for a planned downsizing. In a box of old correspondence, she found something she had not expected to find. A series of letters, 11 of them, dated across a 4-year span beginning the year after the company picnic, written in a hand she did not recognize, addressed to her father at his office rather than the house. She did not read them in full that day. She did not yet feel she had the right to, and the weight of what she suspected they contained made her hands unsteady. She photographed each page, returned the letters exactly where she had found them, and drove home in a state she later described as suspended, not yet certain, but certain enough that the next several weeks felt like waiting for a verdict she had already privately reached. The second twist arrived when Imogen, working up the resolve over several weeks to actually read what she had photographed, discovered that the letters were not from the woman she had seen at the picnic. They were from a different woman entirely, a woman whose name Imogen did recognize, because she had grown up calling her Aunt Ruth, a close family friend of her mother's who had been present at nearly every major family gathering throughout Imogen's entire childhood, and who remained, even now, a fixture at Hale family events. seated at Diane's side at every holiday with the easy familiarity of someone who had been folded into the family for decades. The letters made clear that Ruth's relationship with Imogen's father had begun before the company picnic and had continued for years afterward, overlapping with the woman Imogen had actually witnessed, running in parallel. Two separate relationships her father had apparently sustained simultaneously, while his wife systematically discredited the one person who had tried to tell the truth about either of them. And the detail that made Imogen sit at her kitchen table for an hour without moving was this. Several of the letters referenced Diane directly, in language that made unmistakably clear that Ruth and Diane had remained genuinely close friends throughout this entire period, that Diane's friendship with the woman who was sleeping with her husband had not ended, had perhaps never even been disrupted, suggesting either that Diane had never fully known the extent of it, or, in a possibility that Imogen found almost unbearable to sit with, that she had known and had made a private peace with it that she was simply never going to disturb, the same way she had never disturbed the comfortable fiction that her 11-year-old daughter had imagined the entire thing. The family reunion was already scheduled, an annual 3-day gathering at a rented lake house that the extended Hale family had held every summer for over a decade, attended by Walter and Diane, Desmond and Priya and their children, Imogen and her husband, and a rotating cast of aunts, uncles, and cousins, including, as always, Aunt Ruth. Imogen arrived at this particular reunion carrying considerably more than her usual luggage. She carried the photograph letters. She carried Priya's account of the financial control in her marriage, shared with Priya's explicit permission to use it if the moment ever called for it. And she carried, for the first time in 30 years, the complete and unshakable certainty that she had never, not once, been the unreliable narrator of her own family's history. She had not decided, driving up to the lake house, that she was going to say anything. She had decided only that she was no longer willing to sit through another dinner in silence while being quietly identified, through glances and gentle redirections, as the difficult one. The third twist, the one that turned a tense family weekend into the collapse the entire story has been building toward, arrived on the second evening after dinner, when Desmond's controlling behavior toward Priya surfaced in front of the entire extended family in a way it never had before. Priya had mentioned, casually, that she had been considering returning to part-time work in the field she had set aside when their first child was born, and Desmond's response, sharp, dismissive, delivered with a specific edge that everyone at the table felt even if they could not have articulated why, visibly startled several of the cousins who had never witnessed this side of him. Diane, predictably, moved immediately to smooth it over, suggesting brightly that Priya was probably just feeling restless and that these things had a way of working themselves out with time and patience. And in that exact moment, the same sentence structure, the same redirection, deployed in front of an audience this time instead of privately, Imogen finally spoke. She did not raise her voice. She said, evenly, that she had heard her mother use that exact phrase, work themselves out with time and patience, in nearly the same words, when Priya had raised a concern months earlier, and that she had heard a version of that same sentence used on her, at 11 years old, at a company picnic 30 years before. The table went silent in a way Imogen had never experienced at a Hale family gathering. Not the silence of people who did not understand what had just been said, but the silence of people beginning, in real time, to understand exactly what had been said. What followed over the next 40 minutes was not a single confrontation, but a cascading one, as the careful architecture of 30 years began coming apart from multiple directions simultaneously. A cousin named Felix, who had been a teenager at that long-ago company picnic and had never spoken about it because he had absorbed, the same as everyone else, that Imogen's account was simply incorrect, said quietly that he remembered seeing something himself that day near the parking lot, something he had never mentioned because by the time he was old enough to understand what he might have seen, the family narrative was already fully established, and he had simply assumed his memory was unreliable in the same way Imogen's was supposed to be. Priya, given an opening she had clearly been waiting months for, described the financial situation in her marriage in front of the full table, no longer privately, no longer asking anyone's permission to be believed. And Imogen, when the moment arrived, did not produce the letters as a weapon thrown across the table for dramatic effect. She asked her mother directly, in front of everyone, whether she had known about Ruth. Diane's silence lasted long enough that it answered the question before she said a single word. And when she finally spoke, what she said was not a denial. It was an admission that landed with a different and more complicated weight than anyone at the table had been prepared for. She said that she had known for years, and that she had chosen every single time the truth had threatened to surface. At the picnic, in the years after, in every subsequent moment when Imogen had tried to tell her something true, to protect the appearance of the marriage rather than her daughter, because she had believed, with a certainty she had never previously examined out loud, that a difficult truth told was somehow more destructive to the family than a comfortable lie maintained indefinitely. She had not been protecting her husband, particularly. She had been protecting an idea of what her family was supposed to look like, and Imogen, by telling the truth at 11 years old, had been the single greatest threat that idea had ever faced. The reunion ended early. Walter left the lake house that same night, driving home alone, and has not, as of the time of this account, spoken directly to Imogen since, though he did, several weeks later, send her a brief and carefully worded email that she has described as an apology only in the most technical sense of containing the word sorry. Diane and Imogen have spoken twice since that weekend, both conversations difficult and unresolved, with Diane oscillating between genuine remorse and a persistent need to explain the impossible position she believed she had been in, a framing Imogen has not yet been able to fully accept, but has also, to her own surprise, not entirely rejected. Priya filed for divorce 4 months later, with a forensic accounting of the marital finances that confirmed the pattern she had described, and that gave her, finally, independent access to resources Desmond had quietly restricted for over a decade. She and Imogen speak now several times a week, in a friendship that exists entirely outside the family system that originally connected them, built on the specific kind of trust that develops between two people who have separately survived the same mechanism and finally found each other on the other side of it. Aunt Ruth has not attended a single family gathering since. I asked Imogen, sitting with her well over a year after that lake house weekend, what it had actually felt like in the moment everything collapsed, whether it was vindication, in the way she might have imagined it, as an 11-year-old standing at that picnic table insisting on what she had seen. She was quiet for a long time. She said, I think I expected, if this moment ever came, that it would feel like winning. And it did not feel like winning. It felt like grief, mostly. Grief for the 11-year-old who told the truth and was punished for it for 30 years, and grief for the version of my family I might have had if my mother had made a different choice in those first 60 seconds at the picnic instead of every single choice that followed from it. She paused. She said, but underneath the grief there was something else, something I'm still learning the shape of. It was the specific relief of finally being believed by people who had spent 30 years training me not to expect it. Felix remembering. Priya speaking without permission. My mother's silence answering a question she could not bring herself to answer out loud. I did not need any of those things to know I had been telling the truth. I had always known that. What I needed, and did not realize how badly I needed it until I finally received it, was for the truth to stop being something only I was carrying. Thank you for being here on Venom Thread tonight. If there is a word that has been attached to you in your own family, if you have spent years being told that your perception of something true cannot be trusted, it might be worth asking who that word has actually been protecting all this time. Subscribe and hit the notification bell. New darkness next week. And we are nowhere near finished.